Hello everyone, my name is Quinn Reed and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. I'd like to welcome you to the Dole Institute of Politics and thank you for attending today's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come by with a microphone to you. Please ask just one brief question, no filibustering. And now, please welcome Director of the Dole Institute, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Quinn. Thanks to all of you for coming out. We really appreciate your support of the Dole Institute and appreciate your support of the first and a second series put on by the Leavenworth History Department. On July 6th, 2011, I looked up the date, Jim, Professor Ted Wilson from our history department brought Jim Wilbanks by my office to talk about a new series. Jim's idea was that he has an incredible crew of historians up at Fort Leavenworth, and they wanted to put on a series here at the Dole Institute. We immediately saw the value of that, and out of that came a series that just concluded at the end of last year on the Cold War. Many of you probably caught a number of those, and the quality of the lectures was just really unbelievable. And so after that was over, and I don't remember if I asked you first or you asked me first, but I know I desperately wanted to do this again. So Jim agreed. They went off, figured out what kind of topic they wanted to do, decided on World War II, which fits perfectly with the Dole Institute's mission. And so that's the genesis of today's kickoff of this new series on World War II. We're delighted to have the series here at the Dole Institute. It is going to be splendid and it is going to be very entertaining and interesting. And it's my honor to present Jim Wilbanks. Jim?
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate the opportunity to come over here. This is a lot of fun for us as well. The first series, as Bill said, was, from our standpoint, was a great success. And so I asked Dr. Janet Valentine, who's in the back room somewhere. She coordinated the first effort and now is coordinating the second effort. So this will be the first in a 10-part series that will extend into November. You've got a handout there that lists the presentations over the next 10 months. Today we have John Suprin, who is a former armor officer, 23 years service, has a master's from University of Washington in Russian and Baltic Studies, and today he will be talking to you about the Russo-Finnish War. John?
Well, to start off, with about an hour to go in a topic like this, you never know what you should include and what you should not include. What does the audience know, what do they not know? And so I play it safe and I try to cover all bases. We'll see how that works. But we're going to have to do a little geography, we're going to have to do a little politics, we're going to have to do a little history, a little tactics. All of this stuff's going to be here, and hopefully when I get through my presentation, there will be enough time left at the end for you to figure out what it is you wanted to hear that I didn't give you, so you can work that in. Anyway, I hope this does the volume okay for this? So, a brief chronology of the events that shape what we're going to talk about today. Some of them directly related, some of them indirectly related. The first one up here is in 1938, when the war clouds are gathering over Europe, most of Northern Europe, individual countries, not any part of any alliance traditionally, are trying to craft a policy going into what they see as an upcoming European conflagration. And unanimously, the Northern European tier elects to be neutral. We all know how that worked out. But it was a mighty effort of all of the countries concerned to not be involved in the next big war. And that shapes a lot of what they're trying to do. And it also, unfortunately, leads them down many bad roads, blind paths. The Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all declared in 1938 that they would be neutral, hoping that they would be uninvolved in any upcoming European hijinks. The next thing that happens that's of note, as you can see up there, is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This is at the end of August 1939, a deal between Russia and Germany, and the deal has secret protocols. Is anyone aware of those secret protocols? More or less divides a German sphere of influence and a Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, and it includes all of these countries which are trying to be neutral. After the fall and the division of Poland, almost immediately, the Baltics are called up individually by Moscow because Moscow has security concerns. And the security concerns that Moscow has include I'm okay now. Include the ability of the Soviet Union to station troops in their countries. Is anyone aware of how this worked out? Rather than providing endless security, which is what the Soviet Union promised, there's a subversion of independence and a takeover of all three states sequentially by the Soviet Union, and that happens in 1939. The states finally lose their independence officially in 1940 and spontaneously join the Soviet Union. Now, as that's going on, as the Baltics already have Soviet troops on their territory, but have not yet formally lost their independence, Finland is approached by the Soviet Union with security concerns also. Now, I'm going to show you a map in a minute. Hopefully, it'll be bright enough on the slide where you'll be able to see the areas of concern. But there's a requirement for territorial adjustment. Finnish borders are somehow incompatible with Russian security interests, and so they would like an adjustment of the borders to help them with that. They would also like the ability to station Russian troops on Finnish soil as a preventive measure against external adventurism. Among the countries listed as the external adventurists include Britain and France, although Germany is really probably the Soviet Union's biggest concern, but because they have a non-aggression pact in effect at the time, that's not one that they mention a lot. Okay, to continue this, just to get the slide finished, there are a series of visits where Moscow calls the political leadership from Helsinki to Moscow for discussions about how they're going to work this deal. There's 3 separate trips. They end at the end of November 1940, end of November 1939, with an impasse. The Soviet terms are not met by Finland, and on the 30th of November 1939, the Soviet Union attacks Finland. The other things that you see up here include a couple of the major events that we're going to talk about today during the war. The war lasts 105 days, from the 30th of November to the 13th of March 1940. Some of the major events that we're going to talk about are the Suomussalmi and Rata Road battles. We'll also talk a little bit about the Mannerheim Line, which is kind of the main effort area for both sides, both the Soviets and the Finns. The Timoshenko attacks, which is the final Soviet attack at the end, which finally breaks the Finnish defense. And then we'll see what the map looks like after it's all over. Okay, let's see. Okay, so up in the map here you have Finland. Now, I have a laser pointer which is bright enough probably to blind me, but not for me to indicate on the map anything to you. So I'm going to try to talk you through the map a little bit. You see Finland off on the right-hand side there. There's there's an isthmus coming up right here. You can see it. That's the Karelian Isthmus. There's a lake right next to it called Lake Ladoga. And then you can see southern Finland. Southern Finland is the part of Finland that has most of the population, most of the infrastructure, and most of Russia's security problems. You see the Gulf of Finland at the bottom there, at the bottom of Finland, opening out into the Baltic Sea. Because the southern coast is Estonia and the Soviets already control Estonia, what do you think it is that they're looking for? They're looking for that pinch on the northern coast. They want to be able to control the Hanko Peninsula, which if you look at Finland, you go all the way to the Gulf of Finland where it opens up wide. There's a little teeny peninsula right there. They want to set up a naval base there. They want it at least for 30 years, and they want to garrison it with 5,000 Soviet troops and build an anchorage. The Finns have a problem with that. They also want the border on that isthmus moved back because it's inconvenient. Finland is too close to Leningrad. And as Comrade Stalin says, since we can't move Leningrad, we need to move the border. And this is one of the main terms that is given to the Finns. The Finns monkey around trying to figure out if there's some way that they can accommodate the Soviets. And at the end of the day, the answer to that is they cannot. So access to the Baltic Sea, security of Leningrad, and then if you look all the way up at the top of the map, all the way at the tippity top, just up to the left of that little number 1 up there, there's a little tiny peninsula up there, and there's also security concerns. The Soviets want that too, because access to Murmansk, the Soviet port of Murmansk, is up there, and they don't want somebody else holding that. So that's the other part of their security problem. There's also some stuff in the middle that they don't like either. They want a little bit of that shoved around. But, you know, no big deal. It's 11% of Finland's territory that they want. What's that among friends? Okay, in discussions, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of Finland go and talk to Molotov and Ribbentrop, Molotov and Stalin, rather. 3 times in Moscow. Stalin is there at all 3 of the visitations, weighs in, tells jokes, makes comments, including snide remarks. And this is a telling quote, as the Finns promise that their territory will never be used on their honor against the Soviet Union. Nobody will ever be allowed to stage out of Finland against the Soviet Union. Stalin's quote is more or less, the great powers, we included, the Soviet Union included, the great powers will never let you do that. So it doesn't matter what you say you promise. You can't deliver, so therefore we will adjust things the way we want to adjust them. So, military planning. Once the Soviet Union is pretty sure that Finland is not going to do what the Baltic states did, which is just roll with the punches, see how the treaty works, and then be absorbed later, there's going to be resistance. Then there's a requirement for some kind of a campaign plan. And there are several that are floated. The 2 main ones are Boris Shaposhnikov. Shaposhnikov is probably one of the finest minds in the Red Army. His idea is you weight very heavily a conventional force structure going from Leningrad up that narrow isthmus, which is where the Finns' main defenses are, and you barrel through using all your force. In other words, there's that one narrow front, and that's the only place you fight. Stalin thinks that that's suboptimal. And the reason he doesn't like it is because it's not really fancy. Now, you have to think about what has happened in the past. Germany has been impressing the world with its various coups in Europe, and the world is all a Twitter about German capability. And so Stalin believes that if the Soviet Union proceeds with kind of a de rigueur, regular old mass attack, they're going to look like posers. They're going to look like somebody who isn't with it. And so Stalin prefers another plan, a fancier plan, a more modern plan, a more enlightened plan. So Shaposhnikov is more or less set on the shelf for a while.
He still retains influence, but his plan is disapproved, and he moves away from center stage as far as the Red Army's plan against Finland goes. So, enter these two characters. These two fellas, up in the right-hand side, Clemente Voroshilov, and then Kirill Meretskov in the lower left. These are both, Voroshilov is a marshal of the Soviet Union, Meretskov is a colonel general, but he will be he'll be promoted later. These are both longtime confidants of Joseph Stalin. When I mean longtime confidants, Stalin doesn't have, as far as I can tell, doesn't really have a real friend. Anybody that he would ever treat as a friend. But he does have these longtime cronies that, as long as they don't color outside the lines, more or less live within kind of a semi-security bubble around him. Both of these fellows are inside that bubble. So in the 1920s, from 1917 up until the early 1920s, 1920, 1921, when there's a lot of fighting going on in Russia as a result of the Soviet, the Bolshevik Revolution, and also the Russian Civil War, Stalin is in service with what's called the 1st Cavalry Army. The commander of that is a guy named Budyonny, who's also hanging around in the back, but Budyonny is in the protected bubble, but he's not bright enough to come up with a plan, so he's doing something else, having a sandwich or something. On the other hand, these two guys are more central. Voroshilov is politically reliable. He will, when Stalin says jump, he says how high. He's one of these guys that's in the Red Army that Stalin never has to worry about. Remember, anybody know what's happening to the Red Army at this time in terms of its officer management program? Yeah, they're purging their officer corps, and the purging is not anything like you get a cash benefit and you get to leave, and this is the small caliber pistol at the back of the head, scale adjustment. And so a lot of guys who got to be generals because they're good have become threatening to Stalin. Not necessarily because they're threatening, because Stalin thinks they're threatening. And so there's a large-scale process ongoing in the Red Army right now, which is taking relatively experienced senior officers who really know what their jobs are and turning them into fertilizer. Voroshilov, although he is one of the marshals of the Soviet Union, one of the very few, I think there's 2 of them that don't get killed. Voroshilov's one of them. Budyonny's the other one. These are the dim bulbs, but they're politically reliable. And so when Stalin says, hey, can you guys come up with a good plan to go after Finland, that's more to my liking, Voroshilov's right there to say yes. He needs somebody who's a little smarter than him, so Meretskov crafts a plan. Now that plan is, well, as it says here. Take a look at this. Anybody have any military education or any military background? Attack everywhere. Now the frontage on the Karelian Isthmus, that narrow place that Shaposhnikov wanted to attack, that's about 60 miles, soup to nuts, across. And that's where he said, we're going to attack with everything there. When you take Finland, all of its land boundary with the Soviet Union, it's over 600 miles. And so the Voroshilov Meretskov plan is we're going to attack using several armies spread out all over that 600-mile attack. Now, why does that seem like a good idea? Anybody? Well, here's what they know about the Finns. And some of what they know about the Finns is true, and some of what they know about the Finns is not true. The Finns in 1918, when they became fully independent, had their own internal civil war. And there was Reds, communists and socialists, and there was Whites. And the Whites end up winning. And so they end up with a non-communist government. But the socialists don't go away. There's still plenty of socialists in Finland. And so over time, this idea that Finland is still ripe for the picking into the socialist camp kind of sticks in Moscow's head. Now, what's really happened is this. There are people who are mightily disaffected by the Whites winning in Finland. But over the period of independence, which is about 20 years, the Finnish economy has done relatively well. And so this idea of being a Finn and being independent has almost trumped party allegiances to at least the point where if a foreign country wants to put pressure on you, there's a desire to work together as opposed to work in different directions. This is something that's invisible to Moscow because it's happened over time and they weren't sensitive to the changes. The other thing is the Finnish army is not big and it's not really well equipped. Their artillery park is a collection of museum pieces, not a lot of it, all kinds of different calibers, not much ammunition. Their military budget is so miserably low. One of the things that they do when they mobilize is they have a term, a slang term in the army, and it's the prime minister's name and kalyander, the kalyander uniform. And what that means is you're wearing civilian clothes and they gave you like a hat. Because, you know, the stocks of military equipment were just so small under this government. And this is like, this guy was in power up till almost the beginning of the war, a few months before. But the budgets are so small, there's no real upgrading of anything, there's no real modern equipment, there's no really professionalized training. Most of the officer corps, when they mobilize, are people who are like teachers and businessmen and all this other kind of stuff. They do have a small professional corps. And they do have something that's called the Civil Guard, which is almost like a voluntary National Guard that does a lot of tactical training in their copious free time. And so there's some military capability there. But it isn't really visible as top-of-the-line military capability. It looks kind of amateurish. And if the Soviet Union, amateurs don't cut it. The Soviets have more armored vehicles than the rest of the world combined. The Soviets have more aircraft than the rest of the world combined. They're not going to let something like Finland, who can't put shoes on their soldiers' feet, stand in the way of the Soviet agenda. So what the heck is wrong with 600 miles? They'll have planes from north to south, they'll have tanks from north to south, they'll have divisions and corps and armies all over the place, and the Finns won't be able to match that. Finns don't really want to be independent anyway, and so what's the big deal? The interesting thing about this slide is if you look at the, not the fact that it has all this, you know, we're going to use mobility and armor and aircraft, that's all kind of cool, and it shows you're modern and it shows you're industrialized, and that's what Stalin really wants. But if you look all the way at the bottom, once they decide to do that, they actually have some guys in the Red Army, and they ask questions like, okay, so how long do you think it's going to take? And one of the planners that's working for Meretskov says, and this is a quote, "I'd be happy if it was done in 2 or 3 months." And he's reprimanded immediately. He says, how can, and the reprimand is, how can you think that? It's going to be 12 days. So plan it for 12 days. Now, what does this do when you plan a military operation for 12 days, and that's part of the instructions? Now, think about things like food, fuel, ammunition, replacements. If it ain't 12 days, is there going to be maybe a problem? And so this is one of the things that you're going to see come back to haunt the planners a little bit later. Okay, so here's the troop dispositions. There's our friend Voroshilov again, a dashing man. And you can see the troop dispositions, those big ovals. Most of the Soviet forces are going to actually still be in the Karelian Peninsula and what's called Karelian Ladoga. And that's that troop concentration just to the northeast of Lake Ladoga. And the job of those troops is to move around the lake and towards Helsinki. Helsinki is off to the left. You can see that there's a little goose egg 2/3 of the way to the Baltic. That's where Helsinki is. They're going to move around Ladoga, and they're going to flank. Can you see that little line there? That what looks like a fortified line down in the isthmus. That's the main Finnish defense. So they're going to flank around that, cooperate with those guys that are going straight up the isthmus, and then they're going to move towards Helsinki. Out of the 30-ish divisions that the Soviets are going to use, and 6 tank brigades, all 6 of the tank brigades are going to be in those 2 southern groups, and 22 of the 30 divisions are going to be in those southern groups. And the rest of it is going to be spread out in those northern groups. The middle group, that big long group there, those guys, their job is to cut the narrow part of Finland and cut across where it's narrowest. And the objective there is to cut the Finns off from any aid from outside. And those guys have a terrible time, but we'll get to that later. Up north, the Russians actually do fairly well. And the reason is because they have 3 divisions, all the way up near Petsamo at the very top of Finland. The Finns, if anybody knows the force structure, Russian division, about 17,000 guys. All of them have 20-something tanks organic to them. And so the Russians have 3 of those up there. The Finns have about 1 battalion. Now, 1 Finnish battalion is about 650 guys. Okay, so up there, the Russians don't do too badly. The problem, of course, is there's nothing up there. There's no roads, there's no railroads, and so once you take your little objectives, you just can't sweep over the ground because there's no way to logistically support yourself. So they are the masters of their own destiny up there, the Soviets are, but after they take their couple of objectives up on the coast, they're more or less a boil, what the Finns call a boil, and they can't expand themselves too far beyond that. Okay, so now to the Finns. On the right-hand side here, there's a picture of Field Marshal Gustav Mannerheim. Mannerheim's an interesting guy. Kind of the George Washington of independent Finland, father of his country. Served the Tsarist Russian army his whole adult life. Comes back from service with the Tsar in 1918 to preside over Finnish independence. He knows the Russians better than they know themselves. He knows what they need, he knows what they do, he knows what their strengths are, he knows what their weaknesses are. And so he's a relatively important asset. He is also not connected to the political infighting that is Finland, because he's not political. Personally, he's relatively right-wing, but he is not a political player, so he's separate from that. So when the country begins to warfight, he's made the commander-in-chief. There's a legal kind of escape clause. In the Republic of Finland, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And so that's all there is to it. It's got to be the president, except under what's called exceptional circumstances. And so once the Russians get ready, get their war paint on and start coming across the border, it's exceptional circumstances. And so they bring old Mannerheim out of mothballs and put him in charge of the Finnish army. Here's what his plan is. He's going to defend with, he has the equivalent of 10 divisions broken down into 3 corps and then a few stuff in non-corps. So a corps is usually 2 or 3 divisions. And then he has some forces that are not assigned to any specific corps. Down in that most dangerous area where the Russians are more concentrated, he has 2 corps on that narrow isthmus with a fortification system known as the Mannerheim Line, which is not really a fortified system that we would recognize, but I'll show you pictures of what it looks like. But it's the best the Finns can do, and it's serious business for the Finns. They do it on purpose. They do it as well as they can. They do it with the means they have, and they plan to fight it. There's also another corps that's on that left flank. So the Russians that would be trying to come around the northern part of Lake Ladoga, there's another army corps there. So it's the 2nd and 3rd on the isthmus, the 4th Corps on Ladoga, and then from there all the way north. So we're talking about 400 miles. There's not much, but the not much has skis, and that matters too. Okay, so there's always this thing of, what is the Mannerheim Line and where is the Mannerheim Line? If you have read anything about this war, the term has probably come up. You've probably seen it. So here's where it is. Here's that isthmus. Once you get to the northern part of that isthmus, Finland opens up. Okay, it gets wider. Down in this area here, there's lots of rivers and lakes and water, lots and lots and lots of water. And so this is not trafficable in other words, this is not one big highway. there's ways you can go and there's ways you can't go. And so the Finns try to tie together all of that natural obstacle, all that water, all those rivers, into a defensive plan to try to make it more defensible. Once the Russians get out of that narrow isthmus, now their numbers matter, because the Finns would not have enough to seal the wound. So it's important for the winner, whoever the winner is going to be, to command that isthmus. Okay, you can see the border between the Soviet Union and Finland down at the bottom there. That's that first red line. And then there's the Mannerheim Line. And between the one and the other, the Finns have stationed about 3 brigades. So brigade, 3,000 men. So there's about 9,000 guys in that area that are overwatching obstacles, calling some artillery fire, trying to fight positions where they can, and then eventually they will retrograde back to that line where there's some amount of fortified fighting positions and things like that. Okay, so what's the Mannerheim Line look like? Well, it's not the Maginot Line. Has anyone ever seen pictures of the Maginot Line? All these kind of mechanical turrets and elevators and underground cafeterias and shells that move on little railroads, and it's really, really sophisticated. And the Mannerheim Line is not that. The Mannerheim Line is big rocks in a row and barbed wire tied to trees, and trees cut down so they're in your way, and open areas cut so when they're full of men, you can kill them. This is just taking nature and adjusting it so your weapons will kill people in it. The fighting positions the Finns make are mostly dirt and logs. As a late break and extra, they introduce that high-tech invention called cement, but it isn't really good cement because they don't have any money. Almost immediately before the war, there's a big shipment of steel plates that go out to try to reinforce these bunkers with steel plates, but at the end of the day, this is not a fancy fortification. This is just the best these guys can do to try to build some kind of fortification based on the terrain. Okay, another picture of the Mannerheim Line. Those are boulders. That's an anti-tank line. So cut trees, sunk in the ground, connected with barbed wire to hang up the infantry, line up a bunch of boulders, that stops tanks, which is very interesting because, when you stop a tank, what do you do? What do you do then? Hey, I got him stopped. What do I do now? Hey, mom, what do I do? Well, if you're a sophisticated army, you use some kind of an anti-tank system to destroy the tank when it's hung up. The Finnish army, the whole thing, has about 60 anti-tank guns. And so they have what they call anti-tank teams. So when the tanks get hung up, here's their plan. Anybody know what the anti-tank team's main weapon is? The Finnish State Liquor Board has a role in it. And the Finns are actually those who come up with the term Molotov cocktail. Molotov is the foreign minister of the Soviet Union at the time, who has done them the big disservice of kind of working them into this war. And the Molotov cocktail is the primary anti-tank system of the Finns. They use dynamite, they use hand grenades, they use crowbars, all kinds of interesting things. But the point is, get as close as you can, disable the tank, prevent it from moving, light it on fire if you can, and then when the crew tries to bail out, kill them with small arms. And that's sophisticated for the Finns. Now, if you're the Russians, you'd think this is all a bunch of foolishness. The problem is, Finland has her own defenses organic to the country. Pine forests. These pine forests are extremely dense. And if you want to move, especially in an armored column with heavy vehicles, you're going to have to move on the roads. If you get off the roads, you're going to get stuck. You're going to get between trees. You're going to sink in the water. There's all kinds of things that prevent you from this kind of sweeping maneuver that would allow armored vehicles to actually shrug off infantry trying to chase them with a bottle of gasoline. In Finland, you really can't do it that well. Now, that doesn't mean to say that this isn't gutsy stuff. Tanks don't come in onesies and twosies. They usually come in bunches. Tank guys don't like to be killed. So when they see people running around, you know, their first impulse is to fire everything you have at everything you see. And so this is still, you know, a high adventure proposition. Here's what the Finns kind of lack. So they have the benefit of, you know, decent defensive terrain. They do a mobilization, and so they're able to kind of wring out of the population about 300,000 troops. Some of these guys have almost no training, some of them have more, but they do a relatively effective job of squeezing a population that's not very big to get a relatively large field force. One of the things that they did in the interwar period is they have large women's auxiliary units that are already trained. They call them LATAs, and there's almost 100,000 of them. And so in the rear areas of Finland, the anti-aircraft observers, the nurses, the logistical services, running the Finnish railroads are all done by female auxiliaries, freeing up male manpower to go to the frontline units. And so this is the way that they take a relatively small population and wring as much as they can out of that population to generate combat forces. But, you know, the bad part, of course, is artillery and ammunition don't have much of it, either one. The Finns estimate that in a war they have 21 days worth of ammo. How many days did I say this fight goes on? 105 days. Well, so they have an advantage because the Russians think it's going to be 12 days. So there's going to be a little bit of an advantage where at least the Finns know that they've got 21 days of ammo, and so they can play with that. But at the end of 21 days, one of the benefits of being the Russians is the Russians produce their own stuff. You know, the Russians are going to produce their own replacement tanks, their own replacement artillery, their own ammunition. Whatever it is that they lose or need, they produce it. The Finns produce almost nothing. So they have to either buy things or beg for things. And then those things have to be delivered, and there's a problem with delivery, and we'll talk about that too. Anti-tank weapons. The Finns have a few anti-tank weapons. They're working on an anti-tank weapon that's just about to be fielded. But really, they're going to have to use bottles of gasoline and tar and detergent with a lit rag. Later on, they get sophisticated, and they have a sulfuric acid ampule as the trigger. So that's the cool Molotov cocktail. It has like a real military trigger on it. But it's still throwing a bottle of gas at somebody. Communications gear. They have less than 200 radios in the whole army. How many miles did I say that front was? 600 miles? Okay, they have about 100 radios in the Army. Most of them are 30-kilometer Morse sets. So the maximum range is 30 kilometers, and the only signal it sends is and that's all there is to it. Most of what they're trying to do is with field phones, but they don't have a lot of those. So most of what they actually do is using civilian telephones. Hello, this is me. I'm calling from Mrs. Paninen's house, and this is a problem coordinating fights. Okay, and manpower is the last thing, of course. There's some of your LATAs. Those are anti-aircraft auxiliaries. Those three there are anti-aircraft auxiliaries. But you know, the good part of the auxiliary program that Finland had was you don't really have to do anything with them other than call them to the colors, because during peacetime they actually had a training program, so the nurses knew how to nurse and the anti-aircraft auxiliaries knew how to do their functions and everything else, and so they were like anything else. They had the right training to fall into their jobs once the balloon went up, as it were. Okay, so here a little bit of statistics for you, just so you can see kind of the scale of the problem. That looks pretty good, looks pretty fair. And I think you can probably see why Stalin would look at this and say, this is not a big deal. The aircraft that the Soviets have, a lot of them are quite good. The modern generation of aircraft that they've been producing for about the last year or so before the war is really quite good. The Finnish stuff is another collection of bits and bobs and museum pieces and biplanes and everything else you can imagine. The Russians tended to fly from air bases that looked like air bases. When they landed, they got a hot meal. They slept in a bed. The Finns tend to work underneath a tent with the air crews using blow torches to keep the engines hot so they wouldn't freeze up when they started them, draining the engine every night and keeping the engine oil warm so it wouldn't freeze, and then pouring it back in the morning. Men sleeping, air crews sleeping on the ground with thermoses of coffee and sandwiches. So, very campy, a bonding experience. The Finns had some tanks. They had 32 of them. About 15 of those were British tanks that, because of fiscal problems, buying a tank's expensive, as you might well imagine. Anybody have one? You see? And so one of the things that the Finns did to cut costs is when they bought these, dozen or so tanks from the British, they bought them the cheap way, was with no sights and no guns. So when the war came, they had some tanks available with no sights and no guns, and they had to kind of work that as an extracurricular project also. Okay, so December 1939, so the 30th of November, the war starts. Here's some pictures of the Soviets rolling into Finland. It's a T-26 tank, and the T-26 is a relatively good tank for the time. Compared to a German tank of the age, it's pretty sophisticated. The armor is nothing special, but nobody's really was in 1939. So the armor will stop a bullet. It won't stop an artillery piece. It won't stop an anti-tank shell. But it'll stop a bullet and it'll stop fragmentation from artillery, and that's what it's supposed to do. It's relatively reliable as long as the Russians haven't messed it up with kind of, not very good maintenance. And it has a 45 millimeter anti-tank gun on it, which has a dual-purpose gun, which has a high explosive shell and also an anti-tank shell, which is relatively sophisticated. As you saw the numbers, the Russians have a lot of these. Look at the terrain. This is what the Russian advance into Finland looks like. It's on the road with heavy vehicles. And so this is where this relatively light Finnish army is going to be able to take advantage. Now, when this stuff shows up, I would be a liar if I told you it wasn't extremely scary to the Finns. There are instances of Finnish units breaking and running as soon as they were attacked by tanks the first time. From the Finnish standpoint, this happens at the beginning and then stops happening. So once they kind of get their legs underneath them, it's less of a problem in the Finnish army. But initially, there is a lot of what you call tank fright. Okay, so here's the main front. If you look at the bottom of that map, you'll see a dotted line, and that's the border with the Soviet Union. Where that fortification line, so 7th Army up to Summa, 13th Army up to those bodies of water, that's as far as they get before the end of December. And at the end of December, what you find is the Finns have actually succeeded in stopping the advance of the Red Army, causing it great losses, grinding it to a halt, and so that line becomes static from the end of December till the beginning of February. This is not done at low cost. So lots of Russians get killed, lots of Finns get killed, but the Finns are capable of stopping Russian forward progress and also busting a lot of their morale. So a lot of the units are going to have to be replaced by other units to continue forward. Okay, so I want to talk about this. Anyone ever hear the term motti? M-O-T-T-I? It's a Finnish word. It refers to something like it's a bunch of wood, firewood. And there's something in this war that's referred to as the motti battles. And here is briefly what the motti battles are. Russian units bound to their road network form these long tendrils going into Finland. The Finns find that if you find the right pieces of ground, you can stop the snake. You can stop it at its head, and then the thing arrests itself in place. Now you have this long column. The Russians have almost no mobility off the road. They have no logistics off the road. They fear the forest because they are lost. And so they tend to stay relatively close to the road and relatively close to their vehicles. The Finns, on the other hand, move up and down the column and they more or less pick places to break the column. And when they break the column, they break it into components. The moti. The moti is supposed to be a unit that is too small to effectively fight back. And so what you do is you isolate these groups. That's kind of step one. And then step two is you figure out who the weak sister is. And you begin to annihilate those pockets one after the other. And this is what's referred to as the moti battles. These are tremendously effective. And this is one of those things that before the war, there's no such thing as doctrine like this. The Finnish army never thought, this is what we'll do. This is just how it works out. A lot of their guys have experience as woodsmen. They have experience living in the outdoors. The cold weather, and it's extremely cold, doesn't vex them as much as it does the Russians. Their clothing is better. Their equipment is better for what they're doing. And when they see a problem, their basic idea is, and this is kind of how command works in the Finnish army, when you see a problem, figure it out and solve it. And that's really what their doctrine is. And so based on what the Russians do, they come up with an antidote, which is break them up into groups and kill the groups one at a time. Okay, so this is the opposite of high tech. The photograph is not very clear, but there's reindeer pulling sledges, and in front of it there's ski troops. The ski troops' heavy equipment is pulled, so heavy machine guns, mortars, ammo, food, wounded are pulled on these sledges that are pulled by reindeer. Reindeer are pretty good in the cold weather. They don't mind it. Horses, got to feed a horse. Got to feed a horse horse food, right? This is different than what you find in the forest of Finland in the winter. And so what's the primary prime mover of anything Russian that isn't motorized? Horses. And it's going to be hard to keep them fed, and once you can't keep them fed, you're not going anywhere. The Finns use a lot of horses too, which they keep fed, but places where it's hard to do logistics, they tend to use reindeers. Can only pull a light load, but you can pull stuff with it anyway. I'm not sure I'm going to go into excruciating detail on this other than to say on the left-hand side, right in the middle of that map, there's a place called Suomussalmi. Suomussalmi and what's called the Rata Road. There's a road going from east to west from a town called Rata, more or less on the Soviet border, and that's the narrow waist of Finland. 2 Soviet divisions are destroyed trying to make that crossing. They cross about halfway to Suomussalmi. They are then arrested and locked into motis. The Finns then destroy both of the motis. And I'll show you what that looks like in terms of numbers. Okay, so here are the things that cause this to be bad for the Soviets. The Soviets have a basic doctrine that says when you go somewhere, you don't retreat. And so once you extend yourself and the Finns trap you, the basic idea in the Red Army is stay put. Okay, this is not going to work well, but that's their basic doctrine. Logistical support. Once everybody is locked into place, what kind of logistics do you think is coming up from the rear? None. Another problem, of course, is Russian heavy vehicles tear up the roads, which make it even harder for wheeled vehicles when they can get through. And so these folks that are in Finland, stranded in these little groups, are more or less eating whatever they have, and then they're going to begin to starve. And they're going to start eating their horse prime movers, and they're also ill-clothed. The only logistical support they have is from the Red Air Force, which drops them things. What happens if you wander away from the road in the woods? The Air Force can't find you and drop you things. You know, you don't change your mailing address without telling the post office where you're going. And so this is another thing that locks the Soviets into these kind of death cauldrons because they can't effectively walk away from them. So you get the logistical support, the doctrinal part, the breakout. So if you actually move away from your little moti hell, the Finns will just follow you and set up another one wherever you stop. So you really don't solve the problem. Being lost in the wilderness is something that terrifies the Russians, and they all are lost in the wilderness, so they don't want to wander away. The forest to the Finns equals safety. The forest to the Russians equals terror. So in this environment, even though they're a small army with not much equipment, there are a lot of advantages to fighting the way that they choose to fight. So here's what the strength looks like at those, in that map that I just showed you in the middle. Soviets start off with 2 divisions trying to make that crossing, with add-ons about 48,000 men. The Finns actually stopped them with 400. Now the number 17,000, once the 400, there's a captain who's in charge of 2 companies, about 400 guys all told, decides that if he just lets this go, it's going to go to its objective. And so he decides that the thing that he can do with 400 guys is not try to stop them, because you can't. But if you attack them, then they'll stop, because it'll confuse them. And one of the things that you find is when you hit the Russians, what do? They shoot like hell. So even if a few guys show up and kind of do something, there's all kinds of return fire. How much ammo do these guys have? 12 days worth. Okay, so one of the things that they begin to do is they look at the knee-jerk reactions that the Soviet troops have to cause them to burn their ammunition up. The other thing they do, and this is not nice, but it's just in case you're mad at anybody, you can try this. It's really cold. The Russians have mobile field kitchens. It's a trailer that you can cook soup and stuff like that in. As soon as you identify motis, you wait for the guy to fire up his field kitchen, because you'll be able to see the smoke coming out of it, and you destroy that with a mortar. So whoever's there ain't getting any chow. Okay? So, photograph, dead Soviets, piles frequently 2, 3, 4 deep. Destroyed Soviet tanks, same place. Those are BT-5s, another very sophisticated tank. These things on nice firm ground can go 35, 40 miles an hour, but they're not going 35, 40 miles an hour here. More destroyed Soviet tanks, same place. And when the Finns destroy each one of these things, they'll strip the whole place of anything that's usable, all the artillery, all the ammunition, anything that looks usable, they'll ship it back. The Finnish army will redistribute it, and then they move to do the next one. So actually, the Finns have more guns, more artillery, and more ammunition at the end of the war than they did at the beginning of the war. This is a term the Soviets coined for the war of the White Death. Finnish officer at Suomussalmi. Take a look at that real quick. This is one of the 2 divisions. The 2 divisions destroyed were the 44th and the 163rd. Out of 17,000 men, 1,700 made it. Either made it back to Soviet lines or became prisoners. So 90% were killed. Human blood froze. There's weird things that happen to you when it's really, really, really cold. People can't breathe properly. Gangrene starts really quickly in the cold, and so the Soviets are amputating arms and legs for light flesh wounds. And when Finns come and find field hospital sites, they find piles and piles of arms and legs that have light flesh wounds on them because they're so afraid of gangrene. So how cold is it? Temperature's down to 58 below 0 Fahrenheit. The lubricants on the weapons freeze. So you can be firing your weapon and you pull the trigger, the weapon fires, you can't open the bolt. The Finns use a workaround. They use a glycerin alcohol mix, and that allows them to get their weapons functional. Soviet lubricants freeze. Soviet engines can't be stopped for more than 15 minutes. How much fuel do you have in that tank? 15 minutes, the engine components will freeze into each other, and you'll never be able to start it again. And this is significant also when you're trying to sneak up on somebody. If there's a bunch of guys stuck on the road, every engine is running. So if you're the Finns, brum, 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 brum. Yeah, they're over there. If you're the Russians, you can't hear the Finns because brum, 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 brum. Your engines are running until they're not running. And then when your engines stop running, you get kind of banging on, the Finns will frequently bang on a tank and use their pidgin Russian to say, death is knocking on your door. Okay, ski troops. Russians try to use ski troops also. If you go back down to the bottom, you'll see what happened to them. Stalin dissatisfied at the end of December, early January. Vorshilov, his old chum who he's mad at, says, you know, part of this is your fault, you killed all the generals. American involvement. Finns are asking Americans for help. Take a look at that. Equipment from outside. A lot of this doesn't get delivered because of what countries it has to go through and what holdups there are in each country. Nobody wants to make Germany mad. Nobody wants to make the Soviets mad. So there's a lot of starting and stopping and a lot of late arrivals of equipment. These are volunteers that actually fight on the ground. 8,000 Swedes, 800 Norwegians, 800 Danes, 450 Hungarians, 350 Americans, 230 British, 150 Italians. And so this is what happens after a break in the action in January. Russians get themselves together, put Timoshenko in charge. Timoshenko replaces the old team. He wants to do the plan that was disapproved in the first place. We're going to barrel through. And this is his words. We will compel him to lose blood, something he has less of than we. This is very brutal, direct. Here's a guy who knows what his tool can do, and he's not interested in dancing around and looking modern. Soviet gun moving up in February. So look at this map. In the middle there, you see the Suma line. That's where the line was in end of January when the Russians launched their next attack. You see those arrows, and you see those arrows that are crossing the water? Because the Gulf of Finland is frozen up to 3 feet thick, and so you can run tanks across the water. The Finns can't defend that wide, so the line is flanked. Finnish artillery actually fires into the ice, smashes the ice, tanks fall in, guys fall in, trucks fall in. They come again. This is the end game when the line is finally broken open. Mannerheim counsels the government to seek peace immediately because while he still has an army, you still have a leg to stand on. If the army is lost, there's no negotiating. That's the loss of terrain. You can see the red bits. Here's your casualties. And I've been being heckled in the back for a while, but I guess we have a few minutes for questions. I don't know how many, but we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Hi, good presentation. I was wondering, after the purges in the 1930s, would you be willing to say that this Finnish war, it helped the Red military get prepared for the onslaught in 1941? And had this war not occurred, the Germans might have taken Moscow in 1941.
Because we only have 2 minutes, I'll answer yes. I think yes. There are a lot of lessons learned. The Russians go out of their way to try to learn them. Their clothing's better, their winter fighting's better. All of that stuff is better as a result of the terrible pasting they took in Finland.
A brief question. At the beginning of this talk, you talked about two different plans. One that was rejected by Stalin because I get the impression that the second plan made a louder international statement as far as what they were trying to accomplish. The result was that they lost a huge amount of troops and material. If they would have gone with the first plan, do you think what kind of difference would that have made? More specific, less?
I'm guessing because the first plan, the one that was disapproved, ends up being what they do at the end anyway. That probably had a better chance of being successful. And the reason is logistically, if you take a look at it, the Russians would have had an easier logistical time reinforcing that narrow fight until they finally broke through. and they wouldn't have had to lose all those other guys. And a lot of the guys that they lose in large numbers are those guys that are actioning north of that, up in kind of central Finland.
Did the Finns ever consider guerrilla warfare?
Actually, a lot of the fighting that's done in the middle looks like guerrilla warfare. They're using regular troops. They tended to withdraw their civilian population as far away from the fighting as they could. Most of the land that was taken, Finnish land that was taken by the Russians, there were no civilians there because the Finnish army had already evacuated them. But they did use hit-and-run guerrilla type operations with their regular troops, especially up in northern Finland.